room, actually. All righty.
I'm making sure I'm silenced.
Totally. All righty, and we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to PNP Live. My name is Beth Wong, and I'm an event coordinator at Politics and Prose. We thank you so much for joining us here tonight. At any time during our event tonight, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase tonight's book on PNP's website. There is a hardcover version, which Erin and Christina will be talking about tonight, and there's also a young adult version that we offer at Politics and Prose as well. And so we encourage you to check out both for the voting age people in your life, for yourself, and for those future voters who could benefit from the information in the book. This evening, you can ask the author a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing your question in there. On to the main event. I will waste no time. Voting is a prized American right and the topic of debate from the earliest days of the country. Yet in the 2016 presidential election, about 40% of Americans did not vote. Why do so many Americans choose not to vote, and what can we do about it? The problem, journalist Erin Geiger Smith contends, is a lack of understanding about our electoral system and a need to make voting more accessible. In conversation with Erin tonight is Christina Peterson, congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, you guys.
Thank you for having us.
I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much to Politics and Prose for having me. I, of course, as I'm sure everyone says every time, wish we were doing it in person, but I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to be here with Christina. I reported a lot of this book from Washington, including in the basement there at Politics and Prose, did some writing and ate a giant cookie. It was fantastic. So I'm excited to be here. And Christina, I'm ready for whatever you want to ask me. Let's do this.
Excellent. Well, I was thinking about how 1 year ago, you were just submitting the manuscript for this book. And I remember it very well because I was 8 3/4 months pregnant and your deadline was 3 days after my due date. And Erin, being the great reporter that she is, made her deadline and my baby took an extra week. And at the time, we knew that this was going to be a very timely book heading into the election, but I think in many ways it's become even more timely. And I know, Erin, you see some parallels between the passages of the book in which you talk about the history of voting and the struggles that many groups of people faced in order to be able to cast their vote. What parallels do you see in that struggle with some of the unrest that we're seeing in the country today?
Sure. Voting rights throughout the history of our country has so often been one step forward, 2 steps back. And the steps back are people figuring out ways to keep those people who just got the right to vote from voting. We had the 15th Amendment in 1870 that gave Black men the right to vote. But then that is a huge stretch of time until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that gave federal oversight to laws that were discriminatory, even if they weren't about race. But we're talking about poll taxes and literacy tests and all the things that kept people from having the right to vote, who did have the right to vote, from actually voting. And so, when I think about the progress that was made, and then in the whole conversation today, all the progress that needs to be made, and the way that there are still voting barriers, we're still talking about this, and we need to continue and more seriously have a more constant, honest conversation about how systemic racism plays into voting rights. But I also was so struck by the protests and just thinking what it all means, and do protests work? And then immediately, of course, if you think of the protests of the civil rights era and Selma, that led nearly a direct line to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And even in the suffrage amendment, which passed in 1920, and we're heading, nearing that 100-year anniversary, that movement really made its final surge when they decided to have parades and protests, and when they showed their unity and their numbers in the streets. And one of the suffragists at the time, Harriet Stanton Black, said something that just struck me over these last few weeks, which is that it's much easier to get people to pay attention when they see you marching, and people pay attention to that much greater than the most sound argument. And I think that that's sometimes unfortunately true, and it really struck me in the last few weeks of what protests and marches can matter to show unity and, you know, a groundswell behind a cause.
So these days, no one is prohibited on the basis of race or gender from voting, but are there still obstacles that different groups of people face when they try to cast their ballot? Is that something that exists?
Yeah, we need to think of voter suppression today as it's not the blatant poll taxes or you don't have the right to vote or something like that. It's just barriers that do seem to disproportionately affect Black Americans and other minority groups and young people. So that might be, you have to have a specific ID, or, you know, a study just came out that showed that Black people and Latino people wait 45% longer in line to vote on election day than white people do. That is a barrier to voting. If you don't have a flexible job, especially in normal times when we're not working from home, you know, the way to think about voter suppression now is not that you can't vote, but it's that you might have to jump a lot of different hoops to vote. And if you don't have the will or the inclination, or haven't been taught either the importance or just the mechanics, all of these things can add up to keep people home. And, you know, we should want everyone to vote, and we should make it convenient and accessible for them to do so. And I think we just should all pay attention to when these things like this, the really long lines in Georgia, or the lines we saw in Wisconsin at the height of the coronavirus, are things we just need to pay better attention to.
So this November, voting may look different than in previous November.
It's going to, yeah.
And we know that our president is paying close attention to the question of voting by mail. He was tweeting about it earlier today. You know, when you were reporting this book, did voting by mail come up? And do you have thoughts on, you know, does it give one party a political advantage over another? I mean, I've seen in elections in California, Republicans won a special election, and in Wisconsin, the liberal jurist won a vote by mail election, or not. You know, we've seen sort of mixed results here.
Yeah. So vote by mail did come up because it's one of the ways of voting that people consider to be convenient. From just also a convenience, but feeling like you know what you're doing perspective, especially at California, ballots can be especially long, or all of us go in and you're voting in judicial races that you may not know what they are. And so a lot of people like the point that you can sit down with your ballot, Google who the people is, and make more educated decisions. And so places like Colorado that do it, places, you know, there are 5 states that vote completely by mail. And so the focus at the time of the book was, okay, this is something convenient. There's definitely more and more states doing it, or, you know, all states have some form.
Hey, Erin,
Fraud was not a topic. I mean, I really think it's very important to say, yeah.
Oh, so sorry, your screen froze. We've got you back now, though.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. I don't know.
We're talking about fraud, Erin, and to what extent is a problem?
Right. So the vote by mail does not have issues with fraud. It just doesn't. The states that have been doing it for a long time haven't had that problem. California, which has been increasing over the last several years, don't have that problem. There are many, many protections in place. And it was kind of just another thing that I realized, if we all knew sort of more about how other states voted, we'd immediately feel more confident and not have so many questions, because every state does it so differently. If you live, for instance, in Texas, as where I grew up and my family does, why would you know that Utah is voting by mail? I mean, you wouldn't. But if we have that information, I think it can make us feel more comfortable about the safety of it. And I really hope that the focus on vote by mail can be both education and supporting local election boards that are going to have to work so much harder. I mean, the logistics of this are going to be a big deal, and I wish that could be the focus.
And Erin, do you see evidence that one party benefits in this?
There really isn't. I mean, it is states that lean Democrat that have it, some of the states that do, but Utah is a pretty red state and they elect a lot of Republicans. The states that have it elect Republicans as well. I mean, it's just that hasn't been something that the results have shown. And I don't think anyone can have an idea of what it's going to mean in the widespread way that it's going to be in November. I mean, it just is, people are guessing if they think they know exactly how that it's going to work out on such a massive new stage where where many people are doing it for the first time.
Yeah, I think a lot of projections of what voting is going to look like in November depend a lot on what the virus looks like then, who might be more likely to do a vote by mail ballot.
Sure. Ages, all of those things. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to pull back a little bit and get a sense from you about how you came to take on this book and report on this issue.
Sure. It's sort of two strings that came together. The first was that after 2016, I just had so many questions that I hadn't had after previous elections. What happened with polling, the electoral college popular vote versus the electoral college, and had that, I wasn't aware of how many times it had happened before, Bush v. Gore. What role did the media play? What role did misinformation play? Just all of these big questions that I kept just trying to figure out my role and where I could answer them and report. And I, in the meantime, spent time writing about female entrepreneurs and podcasts that I thought were doing a good job informing people, political art, that sort of stuff. And I was not watching Instagram, I was scrolling Instagram one day and watched a video of Reese Witherspoon interviewing, what's wrong with me? Reese Witherspoon interviewing the author Ann Patchett. And Ann said that she was writing a book on women and voting. And I didn't know Ann Patchett, but like I said, I'd written a lot of book stories. And so I emailed Ann's publicist and just said if Ann needed help researching, I was a lawyer before I was a reporter, so I'm comfortable researching the laws and all of that. And if she wanted some research and someone to conduct background interviews, I just thought it would be an interesting side project. And I just wanted to be a part of whatever Ann was doing. Like I said, though, I didn't know Ann. She emailed me back and we just kind of figured out a way that I would help her. And I would research a topic a month, and she was writing a novel at the time. And so the idea was this would be my side project. I would research, send her a packet a month, and she would write a novel in 2018 and I'd hand it over in 2019. But what instead happened was I became just obsessed with the topic. And instead of it was supposed to be less than a quarter of my time, and it definitely inched up toward 90% of my time. I just kind of couldn't stop researching. At a point, Anne was like, should I be paying you more? What's happening here? Because the work product was excessive. But then toward the end of 2018, Anne realized that she wanted more time to work on her novel that became The Dutch House, and that writing the voting book was going to be tight. And she just called me and said, I feel like this is your book. You've done so much research. You're clearly passionate about it. Do you think you would take this on? Would you want to write a book? And I had a very, very short period of time, like 2 weeks maybe, to come up with the outline and how I would write it. And though I really hadn't been thinking about writing the book, the outline, what I would want to tell came to me pretty quickly, and it actually stuck. The book is what that outline was. So that's kind of how it happened. But as soon as that happened, I had to really start reporting, because I'd done research, but my book was, that's what I'm a reporter. That's what I do. So my book was going to be much more reported. And so I had to immediately start sprinting, and it's sort of been a sprint until I sat down at this chair is what it feels like.
Tell us about some of the most interesting people that you met when you were doing the reporting for this.
What was so fun about it, researching the history was it's tough. We have a tough voting history, and it could sometimes really bring you down, and even the victories are so hard fought. And so the research was just sometimes a lot. And so when I got out there and started meeting these people who are working so hard to get young people to vote, for instance, my first reporting trip before the deal was even signed, I took a leap of faith and went to this voting conference in Los Angeles with the actress and activist Yara Shahidi, who's just a brilliant young woman who has sort of made it her mission to help people learn about voting and why it's important. And she gathered young people from all over the country. There were some from every state, and just brainstorming on how to get people to polls, whether it's like YouTube makeup tutorial stars talking about voting while they're doing their videos, just all of these things that were so genuine and hopeful. I reported on the gerrymandering case at the Supreme Court. And so talking to lawyers at the top of their game is always exciting and interesting. An attorney in California who decided that it needed to be easier for high schoolers to vote. And she just researched the laws in every state of when in some states you can pre-register at 16 or 17. And she just dove right in and figured all of that out. Michelle Obama has started this massive organization, and her team is brilliant and dedicated. So that it was just seeing all the people that are doing the work, and then people who make their life learning about the Electoral College. Those are fascinating. Those that I talked to were men, fascinating too. So there was just so much, because I covered the entire spectrum of voting. I feel like I got to meet people who came at it from every angle, and that was really fun.
Well, as a treat for our viewers,
sure.
Is there anything that didn't make it into the book that you would have loved to put in if you had just a few more pages, but you didn't? And so what are some fun things that you learned that just didn't?
Let's see. A story that I just thought was fascinating, and another thing that informed today is one that, sounds, I don't know if it sounds inconsequential on the surface, it shouldn't, but there was a time, in the earliest part of the suffrage movement which stretched from 1848 to 1920, women were still in the corsets and the long skirts that dragged the ground, and it was very uncomfortable, and they were traveling so much, and it really took away from what they were able to do. There's even a famous suffrage cartoon making fun because women can't fit in the booth because their dresses are too big. So there was a clothing that became, I don't know if it became widespread fashionable, but called bloomers, but they were, came down to your ankle, and they were sort of blousey pants. And Susan B. Anthony and others started wearing them under sort of, ankle length dresses, little shorter dresses that were looser. And so it was really freeing. And Susan B. Anthony even wrote about how she just felt like she could move and travel easier. But they got so much pushback for this new fashion that they switched back to their corsets because they felt like it was taking away from the cause. So, it's just another thing we still talk about. We are getting much better, but, certainly in 2016, Pantsuit Nation was still a big topic of conversation. AOC's outfits are still watched on the Hill. And so I just thought that was an interesting part of history. And in fact, at a other suffrage exhibit I visited, they showed how the fashions kind of became less restrictive as women finally got toward the right to vote. So that was just sort of telling, but I couldn't fit it in. The suffrage chapter was already packed.
Well, I can't say I'm sorry that we've lost the corsets.
No.
Well, Erin, I know that the Supreme Court has ruled on gerrymandering. That was something you were following very closely.
Right.
Essentially said that they weren't going to intervene any further. Does that mean that this whole debate is over, or are there still things that you are watching?
No, gerrymandering, the conversation has not stopped. So they did in that, the arguments that I attended, the decision was that the Supreme Court wasn't going to step in and stop partisan gerrymandering on the federal level, but immediately state lawsuits went forward. There are activists in many states, like in Michigan, they had a huge victory in 2018 where young people were able to get enough support to get a ballot initiative to amend their constitution to stop partisan gerrymandering in that state, although the lawsuits continue. They've won many times along the way in the lawsuits, but the lawsuits continue. But the biggest thing to think about gerrymandering and just your district lines in general, or that's why the census is so important, because all of the congressional and many legislative lines will be redrawn in 2021 after the census. And so there's always just a lot of focus on what that process is. So it really, those who are elected in 2020 will make those decisions. And it's why, another thing that I talk about in the book is you really have to think not just about the top of the ballot, but who your state legislators are makes a huge difference in how the country is run as well. So that's keeping an eye on what the lines look like in 2021 is definitely not an issue that went away despite the Supreme Court's ruling.
You highlight a bunch of individuals who are spearheading initiatives and running these programs, but you also talk in the book about companies that are getting involved. Mm-hmm. What role are corporations playing here? What kind of influence do they have?
Okay. Well, I mean, my big soapbox is they need to play a much bigger role, but there are a lot of companies who are spearheading that effort. So one example is Patagonia, the activewear company, if it's fair to call them that, the fleeces. Patagonia closes their offices on election day, and they did for the 2018 midterms as well. But leading up to that, they started an initiative called Time to Vote, where in a very short period of time, they got 400 plus companies to join. And for 2020, indications are it's going to be a much larger number, but to just give employees the time off to vote. So some states by law, you have to give employees the time off to vote. But even in those states, if you have your employer saying, hey, it's election day, I know you're going to need time, or make sure that an initiative counts for early voting too. But companies seem to be able to make the most difference is if they appoint a point person that just tells employees, and if you have a small company, it can be one person. If you're a national company, you may need a person in every state, but to tell people what the registration deadlines are, what issues are coming up that might affect your company. It can all be done in a very non-partisan way, and you can make it fun. You can have departments that are in competition to who has the most registrations or the most pledges to vote. But if there can be kind of a culture change around voting that employers are really invested in, democracy is important to capitalism too. You can't have one without the other. So it's just a huge opportunity for companies to make truly a small monetary investment, but they can make a big difference. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is Hillary Kerr of Who, What, Where, which they have a Target line and a very popular website and a wonderful female-run company. And I was like, was it a hassle, especially to web business? You're posting 1 million stories a day. Was it hard to give everyone time off? And she was like, number one, it's just organization. They had a no meetings day on election day, which is a great thing companies can do too. But she said, there is no emergency in this office that can't withstand people going to vote. And that really is true, unless, you are a brain surgeon, and then you do need to be there and you can vote early. But, I just thought that was something that all companies could take to heart. And it's so simple. And I have a checklist in that chapter that can hopefully make it easy for companies to do. But I think it can make a big difference. I really do.
And did you get the sense that companies were encouraging their employees to vote in any particular way, or was it just...
No, I really didn't. Patagonia is a company that is big in environmental activism, but even they, for their time off to vote, they have stores in every, I believe in every state, but no, every company who was doing it was making certain and were very concerned that it was a nonpartisan issue. It was just go vote. I mean, and places like that, there's an Iowa Business Association that encourages all of its members who are in all 99 counties in Iowa to do this, and tries to really explain that it can be done in a nonpartisan way. And it should be. I mean, I think that's very important to companies, and important to the employees too. But there are easy ways to do it to keep it nonpartisan.
So I know this book grew out of the 2016 election, and one of the biggest surprises in that election was the polling and the questions that immediately came over whether the polling was wrong or whether we read the polls wrong.
Right.
So what did you learn about that, Erin, and how should we read a poll?
I mean, I suppose it was a little mixture of both. They say the national polls are only a percentage off, but it was state polls in the states that mattered that were more off than they should have been, and that was enough to make the difference. So it's not as if there weren't issues with the polls that they're working to correct. But I do think that these things sound simple, but when you're looking at the polls, you can get so wrapped up in it. But I thought one of the most important points for us all to think about is to really think about, are you looking at a poll that's a percent of winning? We heard in 2016 over and over, 80% chance of winning, 80% chance of winning. But Hillary Clinton's actual percentage of vote she was expected to get was always 48. So if you look at percentage of chance of winning, also make sure you look at what the breakdown is for the actual difference in the percentage of votes they're expected to get. Right. And you always, of course, have to keep an eye on the margin of error. And if it's even close to that margin of error, that's something you just really need to think about. And no matter what the polls say, I think the most important thing about polling is, remember, it's a snapshot. And as all pollsters tell you, the only poll that really matters is election day. So to never let any poll keep you from voting. And also remember that usually those polls are, again, talking about the top of the ticket, and there are so many other races down the whole thing that are equally important. So I think just really look at what the numbers are representing, look at the margin of error, and then also look who conducted it. It's very important. Polling is hard and expensive. And if it's something that you're seeing on the internet and you can just opt in to show your opinion, that is not a poll to be trusted. That's, a very select group. So there's, the most important thing is know what you're looking at, but make sure you vote.
And when you were doing your reporting around polling, was all of the polling sort of public polls that people were learning about, or what other uses are polls being conducted for?
Right. I mean, I think it's easy for us to think if these polls are a mess or can be. And I again, in 2016, the polls weren't a total mess. There were many things that happened. So I'm certainly not saying you can't trust polling. You can. But anyway, thinking, what's the point of it? Politicians and campaigns use it to decide where they're going to spend their ad money. And that then is how we see the candidate. I mean, it's just it's a circular thing. And like you said, they have their internal polls as well. So the polls inform the candidates on what are important, or, what seems to be important to Americans. And so it's just a big circle of a situation. So no matter how we feel about polling, it's not going away. So we might as well just understand how to read it.
Right. I'm going to have about 2 more questions for Erin, and then we will open it up to your questions. So feel free to be thinking them up and submitting them in the text box if you aren't my aunt who already submitted her question over email last week. Erin, so you end your book with a checklist for voters of how they should be getting prepared to vote months ahead, weeks ahead, days ahead, and on the day of.
Yeah.
Walk through what people should be keeping in mind now and as we get closer to election day.
Okay. Now, I think one of the most important things is to know what's on your ballot. So know, of course, and November 2020, there's a presidential election. Everyone's certain about that. But know what else is on your ballot. Are you going to have senators? You're going to have congressmen, congresspeople, and start following the news around those people. You know, set up a Google alert, or I think it's very easy to become overwhelmed by the news, and study after study show that by the time the election comes, everyone has terrible election fatigue. But if you kind of look for focused things and just inform yourself, today, right now, go register to vote. The League of Women Voters, Vote 411 or vote.org, those things will walk you through registering to vote. And if you are registered, it's always important to go ahead and check, confirm you're registered. Voter roll purging is a thing that is happening in some states very aggressively. So, you know, make sure that you're up to date. Start watching what's going on. Choose 5 friends and do the same thing for them. I really think that we can make our own vote more powerful by bringing our friends and family and colleagues along. And then, so yeah, the checklist, just, you know, make sure as you get closer, you want to make sure what your options are, especially with mail-in ballots this year. Know, are they going to send you a request? Are they just going to send you a ballot? Do you need to request? Know all of those rules and deadlines. And I think writing them down now is important. November seems far away, but you know, keeping up with all of that is important. And know what's happening in your state as far as lawsuits and, you know, mail-in ballot. There are a ton of lawsuits going on. Keep an eye on that and see how you feel about it and what needs to happen.
Erin, why are the 5 friends important? What's the psychology behind that?
Sure. So if any voting advocate that you talk to says some version of the same thing, which is that the more personal the interaction is between the person trying to get you to vote and you, the more likely you are to vote. It's why campaigns still spend a lot of time walking around, knocking on doors, or as soon as it's safe to do so, they will. So the most important person as far as getting people to vote is you. You have the greatest amount of power over your friends, family, and colleagues, especially if you take the time to help them make sure they're registered, especially with, you know, if you have a 17-year-old niece who's going to be 18 by election day, make sure she knows how to register. Make sure she knows where a polling place is. Make sure you know what type of ID you need. It's all about preparation and also kind of making it fun. There's data that shows that if towns have voting parties the day of election, just gatherings in the square with music and those sorts of things, that actually can improve turnout. And so think of it the same way. Make a voting plan the whole time, and then plan to celebrate, whether it's a Zoom conference or a Zoom party, or you get to
celebrate always.
Yeah, exactly. You know, there's a way to make it fun and inspirational. And if anything that I took away from all of these voting conferences, it was the joy of learning about civic engagement and the power of your vote and feeling informed and empowered. And that's sort of what voting is. So why not share it with all your friends and family and the person who sits in the cube next to you or in your tiny Zoom box.
Erin, one of the things I loved about your book was that there were so many fun factoids about voting and the history of voting.
Sure.
What's, you know, one that just really sticks with you that you always remember now?
I liked all the sort of voting language ones. That party ticket comes because people used to have to bring their own ballot, and so parties would print out tickets with just their names on it, and they looked like train tickets. So that's where party ticket came from. The word ballot comes from balota, the Italian ball, because they used to use small pebbles to vote. I really did look hard to see if that meant they threw them, if like casting a ballot came from throwing, but unfortunately I could not uncover that. But yeah, just lots of little different voting language facts. And yeah, but I tried to sprinkle some of that throughout the book. Little chocolate chips throughout the book.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are going to start with the questions.
All right.
All right. We have a question from Bradley Davis who asks, what's the status on any movement to make Election Day a national holiday?
You know, there's always talk about that, and some states have the day off. You know, what's interesting is I'm not certain that that's a great idea, and I'm kind of maybe an outlier in that, but I think as we've learned, any time when you have no childcare might make it more difficult to vote. It is true that if you're working from home or on holiday, you'll be closer to your polling place. I think that's important. But you know, it's something that is constantly being talked about and has a lot of pros and cons. And every time I think about it, I land on the sort of uncertain side. I want voting to be easy and convenient and everyone to push it. And for some reason, I'm not sure that that's the way to do it.
Yeah. All right, we have Jane Wang asking if there is a way to sign up for vote by mail online.
The thing about vote by mail is you really have to check what your state allows. Every state is different, as we've seen. It's, you know, some states require a witness to your absentee ballot or your vote by mail ballot, and there are lawsuits about that. There are just so many things, so I hesitate even to give general advice other than if you, again, I mentioned earlier, the League of Women Voters vote 411.org. You can search by state and what all the rules are in your state, including, you know, registration deadlines vary greatly from state to state. So it's so important, especially with vote by mail, something many of us are new to really check the details.
That actually reminds me.
Some states do allow you to apply online. Some do, but I think check and double check.
Yeah, Erin, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the differences in types of registration that different states have.
Sure. Yeah, you know, I think one of my biggest takeaways is how different things are state to state and how different voter turnout rates are state to state. So some states, you have to register 30 days before an election, and if you don't make it, you don't make it. If you decide you want to vote on 27 days before the election, too bad. But then some states, a significant number of states have same day registration where you can vote on election day, and, you know, pursuant to everything checking out, it's still very safe. But some states have done that for decades. So it's very just interesting. Some states you can't, there are a few of them left, but Texas, for instance, you can't register to vote online. And many other states, starting in 2016, and it's up to 25-ish now, you're automatically registered to vote if you interact with a state agency like the DMV. So instead of having to fill out another form, you're automatically registered to vote. Some are opt-in and opt-out states. There are some details, but that's a big movement to sort of take the registration aspect off the table for all these voting organizations. So you would be registered to vote if you when you're a young person signing up for the driver's license would be automatically registered to vote. There's some states do that, and there's a big movement toward that because it has been shown to be effective in getting more people registered.
Great. We have a question from a viewer about the some of the voter suppression tactics, including the longer lines that minority voters are facing. You know, what are behind these dynamics? Is there a political impetus? And you know, how else do you see this being translated?
Yeah, I mean, the devil is always in the details, and then sometimes the details aren't exactly clear. You know, in Georgia this time, they had some troubles with machines, but not enough poll workers and not enough training. So these things can be, sometimes the reasons are nefarious. Like I mentioned about the voter roll purging. So a recent Supreme Court case said that states can strike a person from their voter roll if they haven't voted in the last 2 federal elections. That may sound crazy, but they said you can do it. And states do have to try to keep clean voter rolls. You know, if you move to a different state or a different part of the state, you should no longer be on that county's voter rolls, and they have a responsibility, or someone dies, you have a responsibility to keep those clean. But recent studies found that states with a history of discrimination are purging their voter rolls much more extensively. So it's things that aren't really seem okay on their face, and then when you get down to it, they often impact lower income voters and minority voters and young voters just disproportionately.
What do you hear around the question of voter IDs and having to produce identification when you vote? You know,
right.
What does that debate look like these days?
You know, voter ID is kind of a difficult situation because nearly anyone, when you hear you have to have an ID to vote, well, we have to have an ID, you know, obviously to get on a plane or to pick up a package at UPS. I mean, most of us need an ID to go about our daily lives, but many older people may not have or need an ID. Young people who don't drive may not have one. So the long-term looks at voter ID show that it doesn't have, you know, a game-changing effect on elections, really, but it does keep a significant number of people from voting, and it doesn't do anything to prevent fraud. I mean, there really isn't any evidence that it has had any success in stopping fraud, voter fraud, largely because there is very little voter fraud. So it's another one of these sort of circular arguments. But what was confusing to me sort of about it is it doesn't stop what it's purported to stop. States who enact strong voter ID laws spend a ton of time and money in litigation. And it's like climbing a hill that didn't need to be climbed, I feel like. And so it's a battle that I sort of wish we could get past, but we're not getting past it anytime soon.
Our next question is on another battle, which is the Electoral College.
Exciting. How
that played out in the 2016 election, and maybe a little bit about the debate around it right now.
Sure. You know, it isn't surprising that after there's a difference in the popular vote count and the Electoral College winner, that it's rife for discussion. I found it really interesting that it was, you know, the Bush-Gore election and then the Trump-Clinton election were the only two in modern times. And I believe no Electoral College popular vote differences in all of the 1900s. So it's a pretty rare thing. There are states that have signed this pact so the current movement with focus is the states that have signed this pact that say their electoral college votes will go for the popular vote winner, even if their state voted for the other candidate. And that pact will go into effect if the number of states who have signed it have electoral college votes that reach 270, which you need 270 to win the presidency. So I think they're up to, gosh, I'm embarrassed that I'm blanking on the number, but
it's close.
6 or something. I mean, they're close. It's a significant number of states. I believe it's 15 states and counting. So there is momentum, and a lot of people don't understand why the Electoral College, why we still need to have it. I mean, there are historical debates over why we do have it, but the one that is certain is because they felt like presidential candidates couldn't get around the country and meet everyone. And so, you know, somebody in a state that wasn't reached wouldn't know who they were voting for, essentially. Obviously, we don't have that problem. We all get to know our candidates really, really well now. And the other thing that I found interesting was that Congress has multiple times come close to altering the electoral college. It's just that the House and the Senate never wanted to do it at the same time. But there have been hundreds of bills introduced to alter it, and it's just never had the right mix of people supporting it. But I will say, I asked every single electoral college person that I talked to, and then just voting experts and politicos in general. Okay, so it's only happened twice in recent history, but what if it happens again in 2020 and again in 2024? What is going to be the thought both of the public and of politicians if this sort of imbalance and difference continue? And not a single person had any sort of solid answer. I mean, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens in 2020 and, how long the country will feel about if they don't match up. So it's certainly something very interesting to watch.
And what might that look like? What would the practical implications be if the Electoral College were eliminated in terms of campaigning and what the campaign season would look and feel like?
Well, I will say that probably people who run campaigns are better to answer that than me. But, right now the politicians spend all of their time in a normal election and assuming they're out. I think Pennsylvania is I think Biden was there last week is my point. They spend a ton of their time in swing states that have a chance of could go Republican, could go Democrat, and the rest of the country is kind of left out. And the rest of the country is where most of the people live. So, maybe you're going to have some sort of 50-state strategy. I know that the obvious worry is always that politicians will then spend all of their time in big cities. And I'm sure they would spend more time there, but as it stands, they just drop into these big cities to collect money and leave. So it might be good if they had to do a little actual politicking there, I would think.
We have a question about whether there's any scope in the US to move voting to Sundays, as some European countries do, to avoid some of the issues around juggling your job and trying to find time to vote.
Right. There already is, it's sort of like the talk of making voting a national holiday. There's certain discussion and movement, but I think maybe a better way to think about that is to really expand early voting. So a lot of states do have early voting includes the weekends. And so I think that's something, again, it's really important for everyone to look at what their voting options are and figure out early what's best for them. So it's kind of, I think it's part of the discussion, but those things take a groundswell of support and just don't seem to be something that is going to happen. It certainly wouldn't happen before 2020, but we would see what's next. But I think allowing people to vote on Sunday is really important, especially because a lot of religious groups do, things like souls to the polls and things like that. So having that option to vote on the weekend is very important.
We have a question about how the media affects election and voter turnout in particular. Do you see correlations between reporting and news stories and what that means for voter turnout? As a member of the media, I guess I like to think that we have all of those stories that you're writing help inform and inspire people to do their civic duty. Yes, I absolutely do think so. And I think that the media needs to work hard, as I really feel like most journalists do, to get out there and to find the story and to tell the truth. But one thing that I do wish the media at large was better about is keeping voters informed on the mechanics of voting. And, I feel like so many of us, citizens and reporters, were caught flat-footed when vote by mail became such a huge issue because, it was niche until all of a sudden it wasn't. There are reporters
who do an amazing job covering what's going on, and their Politico's Election Land really helps local news organizations keep on top of what's happening. So, I mean, I think that the media does have a lot of influence and play a huge role, but still the most important conversations are what friends and family are having and being interested in. I mean, it was really important to me to have a news literacy chapter of this book, because I do think the news can be overwhelming. And, you know, I have a sidebar on how to watch a cable news panel, because often I think you turn it on and you're like, who are all of these people? So knowing where your news comes from, knowing whether the reporter was on the scene, you know, all of those things I think are extremely important. But what gets people out to vote is so many different factors. And I think the media has a big role, but it might not be as huge as those of us in the media like to think it is.
Erin, a related question on vote by mail. Is
Sure.
there a difference between vote by mail and absentee voting? And is there any difference in how they are counted?
I think the overall answer is no. I mean, it's really the same idea. You request a ballot, you vote at home. Some states do have laws on when you can start counting those ballots. And to be honest, I don't know if there's any difference between I don't think so. Because if you're requesting to vote by mail, you're requesting an absentee ballot. There are different rules of when you can request them. Another thing that I think kind of most people didn't know or think about was that in most states you can request an absentee ballot and don't have to give a reason why. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if you live in those states, you could have been voting by mail every election if you felt like it. And a lot of people do, you know, you use that choice.
We have a question about whether there is any interest in lowering the vote to the age of 16. And I know you talk in the book about, you know, where the debate has gone over the years in terms of where the age should be.
Right. I knew when the voting age, I think, had become 18, but I didn't really know how before that it was attached to the Voting Rights Act, and then all the states had to scramble. I thought that was kind of an interesting story. Yeah, there are, you know, movements to do that, and in some local elections, I think they'll let younger people vote. I'm sorry that I don't know that exact way to describe that, but you know, there always is sort of interest and debate over when is someone old enough to vote, and there are a lot of 16-year-olds who can make a great case for that. They ought to have the right to do it, especially with issues on climate change and gun violence. I mean, if it's so hard to think back because there's so many things that can happen, but leading up to 2018, the March for Our Lives movement and the power of their stories and their just work to get young people to vote, they and many others, you know, made a huge difference in the young people's turnout rate in 2018. So I think that between protests over gun violence and the walkouts over climate change, things like that, young people have a pretty good argument for how policies are affecting them really directly, especially school and gun violence. I mean, that's an obvious connection.
We have a question about whether, when you were doing your research, did you find anything that the US can learn from how other democracies around the world handle voting, either in terms of process or boosting voter turnout?
You know, we kind of have a sad voter turnout rate here in the United States, and some countries, like Australia, has a really high turnout rate. So some countries do have laws that require voting. You know, voting is a required civic duty. The punishments are really pretty low, so I don't think it's any true fear. But there is a thought of the idea of, if it was legally required, would we have a higher turnout rate? And, you know, I don't know. I don't really feel like Americans are going to buy making voting required. But I do think it's important to look at, states like Minnesota, and it has a very high turnout rate consistently. And sort of leading up to their elections, there are all these stories about that their voting turnout rate is expected to be high again. It's something that the state takes pride in. And, they have many of the things that sort of make it easier to vote. And then you have states like Texas and Tennessee that have really low voter turnout rates. And it's where you see a lot of the lawsuits over lack of access to the polls. And so I think that's something, honestly, that we could really think about and focus on, is let's look at all the states who do it well and figure out why, and bring some of those states with a lower turnout rate up. Because I think it's sort of sad that we have such a huge disparity.
Hey, Erin and Christina, sorry. I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Seen a couple questions to the theme of what can individuals do to fight voter suppression and boost voter turnout? And are there groups or activities that you discovered that can?
Yeah, definitely. Again, I've mentioned it several times, but I think that if voter suppression is something you're concerned with, and we probably all should be, but make sure you know what the League of Women Voters is working on, whether it's in your county or your state. It's such a broad organization that's nonpartisan, and their focus is access to the polls. And so they are involved in lawsuits all over the country when if polling locations are closed and they shouldn't be, or they're involved in, I think, more than a dozen vote by mail lawsuits. So if you just kind of Google around and see what they're doing in your community, what the ACLU is doing in your county or state, what another nonpartisan organization called Campaign Legal Center that's very involved with gerrymandering and other issues. So if you kind of poke around at what the lawsuits are or what people are concerned about, and volunteering to be to work with those organizations, or to register voters, or to be a poll worker, which is a volunteer position. You get paid for that, and certainly more poll workers are going to be needed in light of COVID. So those are organizations to look into. If you are a Democrat or lean that way, Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight organization is dedicated specifically to doing that. And look at what LeBron James's new organization that just came out. He just decided to found it after the protests. Just see what any voter-focused organization in your community is concerned about, and many of them are nonpartisan. Find out who your active groups are and what they're concerned about, and I think it's just a great way to start. And really starting local is important. I think at least knowing what's going on in your community is really important.
Erin, this is a related question. How do we handle people who think voting doesn't matter? I find that almost a difficult question to answer, because to me, it's just so clear that it does. But what I learned in this reporting is that I was lucky in that my mom taught me to vote. I grew up in a really small town where voting was not a hassle. It took 10 minutes and was no problem. And then I went to college and I went to law school, and those things were discussed. But for many people, if voting is not part of your life, it's hard to all of a sudden understand why it should be. So to sort of like take a cue from what those voting organizations who specifically work with young people say, is the best way to convince someone that their vote matters is to really start local. So if you're talking to an 18-year-old, you can say, well, you have to vote for your school board, and those people have huge impact on what extracurricular activities are and things like that. Or do you live in a town where there's a red light that nobody thinks they need and it's just a hassle, or do you need a red light there? Your city council is the person who makes those choices. And especially now, I think we have had such a
specific insight into how important our mayors and governors are, and can see that their decisions really impact our lives. And all of those people are elected. And especially in local races are really close, and votes, every vote does matter. And, sure, in a presidential election, you're one vote out of many millions, but still you're in there. You are part of a group saying how you think the country should be run. And I just think that I hesitate to say lucky, because it is our right. It's our right to be able to do that, and we should use it. But for as far as convincing people their vote matters, certainly making it local is important. And then just, if you want something to be changed, eventually it is going to be your elected officials who have to do it. So you can't have change if you don't go vote.
Great.
Hi, Beth.
Hi, guys. And on that note, thank you both so much for this great conversation. It was very prescient and important, and thank you. To everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, the link to purchase Erin's book is in the chat. And if you scroll up a little bit higher, there's also that young adult version for any future voters to teach you, your friend, your the niece and nephew the importance of voting too. So thanks everybody, and thanks for your online purchases. Politics and Prose still is closed to the public, and we really do need those to continue operating and to continue bringing content like this that we're known for and that we're proud of. So have a good one, everybody out there. Stay safe, stay well read. Thank you, Erin and Christina.
Bye. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.